What I'll be presenting today will be work that draws to some degree on a Australian Research Council grant that myself and colleagues, including researchers from the US, China and Hong Kong, as well as Australia, have had, that is called Willing Collaborators, The Rise of China and Changing Networks of Asian Media Production. And what's of particular interest in that project has been the extent to which co-productions around the Asian region have been burgeoning, with China increasingly at the centre of those. And the question of how to move beyond what one of my colleagues, Michael Keane, refers to as the big pizza model, where the pizza is large, that is to say the Chinese market is large. The product may not be hugely nutritious, but there's a lot of it to go around. So going from the big pizza and in a similar way to the made in China discourse of the last 3 decades towards greater innovation and creativity in content development in China is an important part of these co-production arrangements. And I will also say some things about US-China collaborations in this respect, because I think there's a great deal that is of interest in both sides. I should indicate that my own background is one of coming from communication, media and cultural studies. So when I refer to certain key concepts in this presentation, most obviously the concept of soft power, I will be doing that with something of a critical lens, because I think there are important points to be made from a communications and cultural studies perspective about ways in which that concept can be refined. And as I'll suggest in the presentation, I think in many respects it may be more accurate and more useful to be referring to cultural power as distinct from soft power, although in saying that, I've been reminded that the term soft power is not going away anytime soon, so we navigate those rapids. One of the features of recent debates surrounding soft power, let's go to this slide, and cultural diplomacy has been a blurring of definitional specificity surrounding the term as its circulation has increased. In general terms, the most influential definition remains that proposed by the Harvard University international relations theorist Joseph S. Nye, who defines soft power as, quote, the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than through coercion or payments, and the associated ability to shape the preferences of others. In his earliest book addressing the topic Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of American Power, published in 1990, Nye sought to distinguish the command power associated with economic and military power from the co-optive or soft power of, quote, setting the agenda and determining the framework of a debate. He argued that the soft power of a country rests upon 3 pillars, which, as you see there, are culture, in places where it is attractive to others, political values when it lives up to them at home and abroad, and foreign policies when others see them as legitimate and having moral authority. The parentheses that surround each of these terms are important, as they indicate the relational dimensions of each concept. They are the conditions which determine whether potential soft power resources translate into the behaviour of attraction that can influence others towards favourable outcomes. Nye emphasises that with soft power, what the target thinks is particularly important, and the targets matter as much as the agents. Attraction and persuasion are socially constructed. Soft power is a dance that requires partners. I should just note, coming from a non-military and more media background, the use of the word target strikes me as interesting here and perhaps indicative of where some of the conceptual problems may lie. Nye originally intended the concept of soft power for an elite American audience, particularly key US foreign policy decision makers. In particular, Bound to Lead was intended as a response to pessimistic accounts of the future of US power in the world, such as Paul Kennedy's The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. And there's been an ongoing debate, which I'm sure in the US you're aware of, about the relative status of the US in global affairs. But an important factor behind the takeoff of the concept was its take-up in the People's Republic of China, to be discussed in more detail below. But the term also entered into a more popular vernacular. There can be little doubt that the take-up of the term. Using Google Ngram, we can see that there was a period of steady growth in the circulation of the term from 1990 up to about 2000, and then a rapid takeoff of the term after 2000. And what I'd suggest was taking place there was that while the discussion in the 1990s was largely one emanating from within the US and within the field of international relations, the concept took off globally in the 2000s and was increasingly used across a range of academic disciplines. To take the example of communication studies, Diathusu's International Communication Reader, published in 2010, include an excerpt from Nye on soft power, while theorists such as Colin Sparks have critically assessed the theory of soft power and its relationship to concepts more typically related to communications theories such as cultural imperialism and international broadcasting. A recent special issue of the International Journal of Cultural Policy, edited by Ian Ang, Raj Isar and Philip Ma, has sought to apply a cultural studies perspective to debates around cultural diplomacy, drawing upon important contributions by Iwabuchi and Clark, among others. But as I said, the main place where discussion of soft power has taken off has been China. The official discourses will be discussed below, but there are many other indicators of the extent to which soft power has become an important topic of academic debate. A survey by Xi of the database CNKI, the world's largest digital collection of Chinese language journal articles, for articles on with the term soft power in the title, generated 1,777 entries since 2000 to 2015. And the author also noted that there are up to 50 university centres and government think tanks in China devoted to the study of public diplomacy and soft power. The concept has also taken off in popular literature as well as in various indicators developed by think tanks. And here I'll refer to the Institute for Government, a UK-based think tank, which prepared a soft power index in 2010 that ranked 26 nations across 6 categories of soft power and 27 performance indicators. This perhaps sounds a bit like the performance appraisal you may go through, Clay, with 27 performance indicators and a dashboard of criteria and so forth. And here you see what they are. They include cultural indicators, level of inbound tourism, international reach of media, number of foreign correspondents in the country, Olympic gold medals, always important, diplomacy measures such as foreign aid as a percentage of GDP, number of languages spoken by the head of government, that's an interesting one, ranking of the national brand, and so on. There's 27 indicators here. There's educational indicators, the number of universities in the Times Higher Education Top 200, the number of think tanks in the country, assuming that's a positive, and various business and innovation measures, and what they refer to as subjective measures, which include the quality of high and popular cultural outputs, quality of national food and drink, relative international appeal of national celebrities, perceived quality of the national airline, the reputation of a nation's embassies, and the perceived global effectiveness of its head of government. Now, this is quite a potpourri of metrics, I'd suggest, and a very expansive set of categories through which to attempt to measure a nation's relative soft power. It also tends to favour European powers. This is what they came with. France and the UK first, the USA slightly second. Maybe the airlines took down the USA. I'm not sure. Germany. What I want to draw your attention to here is where China sits in that index, 17th, sitting below not only Japan but also Norway, Singapore, Canada, Finland, Australia. Interesting. A notable feature, and Russia sitting at the bottom of the index there. The notable feature of these lists is partly who features at the top, primarily European nations and particularly the United Kingdom, but also who features at the bottom. In particular, the methodologies used seem to place China in an unusually low position vis-à-vis not only major countries, but also ones with less apparent claims to international influence. And I think it would be fair as an Australian to put Australia in that category. The index, developed by the London-based public relations firm Portland in collaboration with Facebook, is particularly notable in this regard. Again, this index finds the UK at the top, followed by Germany, the United States and France. I'm not sure of the methodology behind this one. I came across it from The Economist. But rather incredibly, China sits at the bottom of this list of 30 countries, not only below Australia, which seems to do very well in these measures, but below New Zealand, Ireland, Greece, the Czech Republic, Turkey and Mexico. What is going on here? In a recent overview of the relationship of the concept to cultural policy, Ang et al. Observed that there's a lack of clarity around the use of the term and partly how it conflates cultural diplomacy as intentionally driven governmental practice with cultural relations, which tend to be driven more by ideals than by interests and practiced largely by non-state actors. The relationship between state and non-state actors and between things that a national government could have influence over and those which it clearly doesn't is one source of potential conceptual confusion surrounding the term. To take the Institute for Government Soft Power Index discussed earlier, it blurs measures that are clearly the result of decisions made by national governments, such as the level of foreign aid or the number of international cultural missions, with those that the government itself has very little bearing over, the appeal of its celebrities, the perceived quality of its national food and drink, and so on. If we focus upon the specifically cultural dimensions of soft power, we also find other important distinctions need to be made. Does a nation derive international cultural influence from its news and information-based media, for instance, or from its entertainment media? Are its cultural outputs primarily the products of commercially based media and creative industries, or is there a central role played by government in promoting cultural exports? Is a nation best known for its so-called high culture or its popular culture? And how do we know whether there is influence deriving from such cultural artefacts, let alone anything equating to power? Nye has himself referred to how wide usage of the term soft power has sometimes meant misuse of the concept as a synonym for anything other than military force. And I don't think culture is synonymous with anything other than military force. But as I noted, the place where Nye's soft power thesis has come to have perhaps its greatest influence is China. The Chinese scholar Wang Huning, who served as Deputy Director of the Policy Research Office of the Chinese Communist Party under Jiang Zemin and was appointed to the Secretariat of the CPC Central Committee under Hu Jintao, noted in 1993 that if a country has an admirable cultural and ideological system, other countries will tend to follow it. It does not have to use its hard power, which is expensive and less efficient. The importance of cultural soft power was flagged in various speeches in the 2000s by Hu Jintao, such as his address to a joint session of the Australian Federal Parliament in 2003, where he observed that the Chinese culture belongs not only to the Chinese, but to the whole world. At the same time, speaking elsewhere, Hu expressed concern that the overall strength of China's culture and its international influence is not commensurate with China's international status. Most recently, Xi Jinping's speech in early 2015, titled "Enhance China's Cultural Soft Power," also proposed that to strengthen our cultural soft power, we should disseminate the values of modern China. More work should be done to refine and explain our ideas and extend the platform for overseas publicity so as to make our culture known through international communication and dissemination. And there's certainly been much going on there. A number of you will be familiar with this, which is the Dimensions of Public Diplomacy as developed by Nicholas Cull from here at USC. Cull divided the practice of public diplomacy into 5 elements. The first being what he called listening, collecting information on international opinions, whether by legal or covert means. I believe once upon a time we may have called this spying. But of course, in an age of social media, one can listen to many opinions without necessarily engaging in anything that is not utterly legal. It's also pointed out that in international broadcasting, gaining an awareness of your audience is itself a form of listening. Second is advocacy, promoting particular policies, ideas or interests to foreign publics, typically but not always through one's own embassies in other countries. Third is cultural diplomacy, promoting a nation's cultural resources overseas and or facilitating cultural transmission abroad. The fourth is exchange diplomacy, promoting reciprocal exchanges of people with other nations, for instance as students or as visiting scholars. And finally, international broadcasting, the use of news bureaus, radio and television broadcasting, as well as internet communication to engage with foreign publics. And we can see that China has been very active across all of these spheres. Perhaps putting aside listening, I don't know, but in the spheres in which we know. Hosting major global events, the 2008 Beijing Olympics, the 2010 Shanghai World Expo, promoting international graduate student and researcher exchanges through the China Scholarships Council and other educational initiatives, investing in the international expansion of Confucius Institutes to teach about Chinese language and culture. And I should note that Falk Hartig, who is now associated with the USC Centre for Public Diplomacy, did his PhD at QUT on Confucius Institutes, and we worked together on that. Fourthly, developing foreign language services for China's Central Television, China Radio International and the Xinhua News Agency, and investing in the international expansion of these services, and the promotion of co-production arrangements in entertainment media, such as films, television programs and online games, to capture expertise from other parts of the world and gain better access to international markets. I would argue that one of the reasons why soft power has acquired influence in China is the considerable appeal that exists for a strategy for expanding international influence without the application of military force. It is consistent with the aspirations of Chinese leaders since 2003 to promote China's peaceful rise or peaceful development to great power status, and thus neutralise what is perceived to be the China threat discourse that exists elsewhere in the world. It's also arguably consistent with ancient Chinese teachings such as Sun Tzu's The Art of War, particularly the notion that, and I quote, subjugating the enemy's army without fighting is the true pinnacle of excellence. Glaser and Murphy observed that soft power initiatives in China are primarily seen as cultural in their orientation and sit alongside political, diplomatic and military activities rather than being subsumed within them. From this perspective, the strategy of going global that has been pursued for Chinese and media and cultural institutions, particularly since 2006, looks not only to enhance Chinese soft power internationally, but also has an economic rationale to reverse the cultural trade deficit that China faces by bolstering exports in its media, cultural and creative industries. And here's some ways in which we can get an analytical lens on this concept of cultural soft power. That firstly, we think about what type of media are we talking about? Are we talking about information and news media or entertainment media? There are elements of both, but I'll suggest in the Chinese case the two operate very differently, with the primary agents are state-led or commercially led, and with the cultural focus is high culture or popular culture. Actually, I'll just maybe just stay with that one for a minute. China's approach to public diplomacy is relatively distinct in several key respects. International broadcasting has a particular importance in its cultural diplomacy strategies, with CCTV International finding itself at the heart of strategies to use public diplomacy to improve the image of China internationally. Gary Rawnsley has noted that with communication right at the heart of China's policy-making machinery, an achievement matched by few states, broadcasters were instructed to be more proactive in their conduct of public diplomacy on behalf of the nation and its international interests. Yet at the same time, China clearly differs from, say, the United Kingdom, to take an important example, in that CCTV is clearly embedded in the heart of the Chinese party state, and the prestige that accrues to an entity such as the British Broadcasting Corporation for being government funded, yet structurally independent from the British state, does not accrue in the same way to CCTV. There's also the important distinction that exists in China between news and information media on the one hand and entertainment media and the creative industries on the other. Entertainment is much more open to private capital investment than news, and in the context of China's strategy of going out, there is much greater opportunity for Chinese direct investment in overseas entertainment media, the involvement of foreign media companies in producing entertainment content in China, and co-production arrangements. What I would suggest is that the field of media and communications, as well as cultural studies, have a great deal to contribute to contemporary debates about the role of entertainment media in Chinese strategies to enhance international influence and build cultural power. Soft power is clearly linked to cultural diplomacy. Cull has defined cultural diplomacy as a subset of public diplomacy, which involves an actor's attempt to manage the international environment through making its cultural resources and achievements known overseas and/or facilitating cultural transmission abroad. Cultural diplomacy has meant a country's policy to facilitate the export of examples of its culture. Otmazgin has observed that in relation to soft power as an international relations strategy, culture is seen as a means of public relations and a method of strengthening a country's influence. Whether this is shared by, by cultural producers themselves, I think is an important point that we need to give some consideration to. In his study for the British Council, John Holden argued that there are a hierarchy of strategic aims around cultural diplomacy and soft power. And I should say, actually, one country where the discussion around soft power and cultural diplomacy has been particularly reanimated over the last few years has in fact been the United Kingdom. And these range from familiarity and awareness to positive perceptions, to engaging people, to influencing people's behaviour and getting companies to invest, encouraging public support for your country's positions and convincing politicians to turn to it as an ally. At the same time, for all this attention to soft power, there exists considerable confusion, I would argue, around the cultural dimensions of soft power and particularly how these cultural dimensions are understood. It's typically seen as an adjunct to public diplomacy and the acquisition of power by non-military means, which entails a very broad definition of the term soft. It could be everything from US jets in Raqqa dropping leaflets to alert truck drivers to leave the region in advance of dropping bombs, to Justin Bieber as a case study of Canadian cultural power. This question of it being a synonym for anything other than military force, or as a conduit for behavioural influence and attitudinal change. From the perspectives of communication and cultural studies, well, we have here the tendency to conflate cultural diplomacy with cultural relations and state and non-state actors. But we also have the extent to which the way in which culture is being used in these discourses sounds very familiar to what is known as the transmission model of communication, where the communication of images, ideas and values as packaged in distinct cultural products is a linear one-way process in which the receiving end, i.e. the target foreign audience, note that word target again, simply absorbs the messages contained in these products. What's missing from such accounts are considerations of reception, or the processes through which audiences derive meaning and pleasure from such cultural forms, particularly when viewed in a transnational and cross-cultural perspective. I would suggest that a lot of this is Communication Studies 101, but it's interesting the extent to which it has not permeated discussions of cultural diplomacy and soft power. What results, and why this matters, is a tendency towards a distributional bias in research into media and soft power, where evidence of reach is taken to be synonymous with evidence of influence. For instance, a figure that has been cited that CCTV claims to cover, quote, 98% of the world with 45 million subscribers outside China, tells us very little. It doesn't tell us anything about the composition of that audience or how regularly they engage with the channel or site. Indeed, the survey undertaken by Zhang in 2009 found that the majority of online users of what was then the CCTV 9 site, which became CCTV International, were in fact Chinese themselves, with 43% being Chinese who accessed the site within China. So if this is, the agenda here is around international influence, then those figures don't sound as good as the first set that I cited. Culture is also being understood in terms of its products or artefacts. Essentially, culture is a thing consisting of content, images, ideas and values that is readily presentable. This reinforces the tendency to view the transmission of such cultural forms into other countries as an end in itself, with far less attention being given to questions of engagement with these cultural forms in other countries. There's also the confusing question of whether any of this distributional activity, and there has been a great surge in international broadcasting around the world, almost all of which, and the US is something of an exceptional case here, almost all of which is state funded, is generating any changes in power. Insofar as the concept of power is explicitly articulated at all in this work, it's a relational one and a behavioural one. The ability of actor A or country A to influence the behaviour of actor B or the people of country B. The structural dimensions of power, or the power to decide how things shall be done, and the power to shape frameworks within which states relate to each other, relate to people, or relate to corporate enterprises, is only implicitly considered, if at all, as is the question of the relationship of media as a cultural institution to such power relations. What we also, so as Rawnsley notes, there's no guarantee that the audience for international programming will decode the meaning of messages in a way the source would prefer, since interpretation occurs according to the prevailing cultural, social and political beliefs, attitudes and norms among those audience members. Also, we need to note that there's multiple actors in this field. Does power reside with producers, distributors or audiences? And Clark suggests there are 4 categories of actors who can be regarded as making meaning with cultural products. Policymakers themselves, institutions and individuals charged with implementing cultural diplomacy policy, cultural practitioners, and the individuals who engage with those cultural products themselves. Also, there's the question of whether the cultural influence is a positive or negative one. Possibly Australia's most famous cinematic export is the Mad Max movies. But does this image of a, desolate apocalyptic landscape make you more or less inclined to come visit Australia as a tourist? Who would know? Who would know? And indeed, cultural practitioners themselves are often quite understandably anxious about being enlisted into these tasks. I think, for instance, about the CIA's funding of various art exhibitions around the world in the 1950s and 60s. So this is, again, some of it is Communication and Cultural Studies 101. It's what we would know as the active audience debate. And Mark Gibson, in his analysis of how the concept of power has been understood in cultural studies, makes the point that even from its very beginnings in 1960s Britain, the field has perpetually oscillated between an emphasis on power in terms of the imposition of ideology through culture on the one hand, and agency in terms of the relative freedom of the consumer on the other. And these tensions and contradictions take obviously even stronger forms in the age of digital networks and social media, as users are content producers as well as consumers, and are actively and constantly sharing their and shaping interpretations of mainstream media messages through multiple online fora. The closest analogy to theories of soft power in global communications lies paradoxically in theories of media and cultural imperialism. As developed by Herbert Schiller, Oliver Boyd Barrett and many others, cultural imperialism was defined as the sum of the processes by which a society is brought into the modern world system and how its dominating stratum is attracted, pressured, forced and sometimes bribed into shaping social institutions to correspond to or even promote the values and structures of the dominating centre. The parallels between Nye's concept of soft power and Schiller's concept of cultural imperialism are interesting. Both see American culture as globally pervasive, both see media as having direct behavioural effects, and both define culture around its distribution. The difference being, of course, that Nye identifies exposure to American culture as a positive influence in world affairs, whereas Schiller and others view it as negatively, as a force which mitigates against more organic, locally based notions of cultural sovereignty. Okay, I might just skip a point there. Okay, whatever the conceptual limitations of soft powers from a communication and cultural perspective and its applications in cultural diplomacy, it's also the case that such strategy is nonetheless consistent with a number of recent theorisations of the changing role of culture in its relationship to government. It aligns with the concept of culture as resource, developed by George Eudyssey, by providing an exemplary case study of what Eudyssey refers to as an expedient relation between globalisation and culture, in the sense that there is a fit or suitability between them. It's also consistent with Tony Bennett's understanding of culture as intrinsically governmental, and that the joining of culture to government through cultural policy has been central to its constitution, and with the historical role of extending the cultural reach of the arts of governing. It also links to various initiatives around the display of national culture and the growing role of nation branding, and the changing strategies of national projection in the context of economic and cultural globalisation. It also connects with cultural trade and creative industries strategies insofar as cultural diplomacy and soft power is intertwined with projects to expand cultural trade, investment and exports. This has been particularly marked in the East Asian region, where a number of nations are seeking to make the economic transition from manufacturing to cultural and knowledge-based services. Okay, I think in order to better comprehend the issues being raised, I would suggest that we need to think about whether we should be talking about cultural power rather than soft power. I think the specificity of public and cultural diplomacy strategies can be better understood in that way, and importantly, their relationship to questions of political economic power. We need to avoid using soft power as a catch-all category for an undifferentiated lump of non-military approaches to acquiring international influence. This also suggests that we need to think about what we mean by power in this context, particularly where we're talking about transnational communication flows and cross-cultural reception questions. Okay, as I've noted, one of the critical questions today for soft power debates is the relationship, is how cultural diplomacy straddles the traditional relationship of government to government diplomacy and the plethora of cross-national and cross-cultural exchanges that occur between people themselves using popular media. They point to a role for government in acting as a patron in order to initiate such communication flows, but also at the same time for governments to distance themselves from the production and reception of those media messages. As Nye has observed elsewhere, an important part of global power struggles today are struggles around credibility. In the case of Hollywood film and television, the perceived desire to entertain mass audiences by avoiding overt political messaging is a part of the global appeal of such content, even if, as some of you would know, one can find evidence of links between the big US entertainment conglomerates and government agencies such as the US State Department and the Department of Commerce if one digs not so far below the surface, as Toby Miller and his colleagues have done with the Global Hollywood series. With the BBC, another globally admired flagship of soft power through international broadcasting, the hard-won structural independence of the BBC from the UK government has earned it a strong reputation as an exemplar of public service media and a beacon of independent journalism, even if, again, close observers of the BBC in practice would detect constant political influences swirling around its strategic orientation and its day-to-day strategies. Interestingly, in the UK right at the moment, the people complaining the most about the BBC are the Labour Party, whereas historically it has very much been the Conservatives. A situation that probably suits the BBC quite well in the political conjuncture, but that's another matter. Okay, a simple way of viewing these cases would be to see the United States as occupying the entertainment and commercial strand of cultural power, and the UK the information and state-led strand, based on the cases of Global Hollywood on the one hand and BBC World on the other. But this is misleading. Actually, I just want to go forward. Here we go. Okay. The UK is as famous as these various figures indicate for its entertainment media as for its news and information media, and for its commercial popular culture as much as its state-sponsored high culture. James Bond, Harry Potter, One Direction, Adele, the English Premier League, Top Gear are all inextricably part of the British cultural brand as it is projected to the rest of the world. In the case of the US, its news outlets remain global leaders, even if, as Tunstall has argued, their ascendancy was shaken by the experience of how they misreported the Iraq War, and the US has a central place in the arts, drama, dance and theatre, as well as the prestige attached to its museums, galleries and libraries. Moreover, like the UK, its most prestigious educational institutions trade on values of history, tradition and the dissemination over time of high cultural values that have great appeal to globally mobile students from around the world. So both the US and the UK present problematic exemplars for China in developing cultural power strategies. Okay, I'm just going to skip forward there. I want to draw attention to two very different cases to give you a sense of how you can get a certain polarity. And the first case I'm referring to here is Russia. Russia, at least in the current conjuncture, is largely insignificant in entertainment media, but the state-funded Russia Today television network, established in 2005 with content directed to audiences outside of Russia, has gained a surprising degree of international reach and influence relative to its size. And it's done so, and I say this having visited the RT studios in Moscow last year, by explicitly positioning itself as an alternative to news services such as CNN and the BBC, offering what it describes as a Russian perspective on global events. So the executive producer who I met argued that Russia Today was the first channel to give ongoing coverage to Occupy Wall Street. And certainly when I was in Moscow, the Ferguson events were constantly covered on Russia Today. The interesting thing about Russia Today is there's very little on it about Russia, which differentiates it from CCTV in some quite important ways. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the function of RT, whose slogan is "Question More," as being, quote, to try and break the Anglo-Saxon monopoly on the global information streams, observing that the channel is funded by the government, so it cannot help but reflect the Russian government's official position on the events in our country and the rest of the world one way or another. If Russia represents one end of the soft power spectrum in relation to international media, India provides a very different and very sharp point of contrast. While there is some coverage of international events on Indian private 24-hour news channels, its primary state broadcaster, Doordarshan, is largely unavailable outside of India. By contrast, Indian entertainment media has rapidly expanded its global reach, and Bollywood has become one of the world's leading centres of film production and global popular culture. And I won't dwell on the reasons for the success of Bollywood. Daya Thusu has discussed this, but he's noted that its films appeal to family and community-oriented values and also to religious sentiments, very popular throughout the Asian and Middle East diaspora. Two nations that directly influence China's decision makers in their thinking about cultural soft power are Japan and South Korea. And Japan, which in the 2000s Japan had been pursuing something that could be considered akin to a soft power strategy without calling it a soft power strategy. The promotion of a distinctive national identity in the Asian region in particular, and addressing the historic problems associated with Japan in the Asian region through its commercial popular cultural products. And Japanese popular culture became a central part of the identity of the fast-growing Asian middle-class youth culture. In the 2000s, this was increasingly branded around notions of cool Japan, gross national cool, and pop culture diplomacy, led by the media and creative industries, to promote the rise of Japan, as Iwabuchi refers to it, as a global cultural superpower. But the Japanese case possesses some distinctive structural weaknesses. One is a historical underinvestment in the arts and culture by governments that that the concept of the developmental state, which Japan pioneered with regard to manufacturing, has not extended across to its cultural policy, or only very belatedly. And also, of course, the historical and ongoing tensions between China and Japan that generate issues around Japan being seen as an exemplar within China. And here you see favourable views of Japan are quite low in China at about 7%. This from a 2014 study by the Pew Foundation, as compared to 56% favourable views of South Korea in China. You're probably also there interested in the figures on the US. Very positive perceptions in South Korea and the Philippines, less so in Pakistan. Not surprising, but that's a different topic. Okay, the South Korean case has been more of a mixed model. The state has taken a very active role, particularly after the Asian financial crisis of the late 90s, in promoting cultural exports, the establishment of the Korean Creative Content Agency, or KOCA, in 2008, and intensified commitments to promote brand Korea globally, perhaps best exemplified by the massive success of Gangnam Style, the quirky pop hit by the artist Psy. Korea faces a challenge in terms of its cultural policy strategies of how to position itself as neither imperialistic nor as purely commercial. So the Korean wave, or Hallyu, has been something of a double-edged sword in developing a global brand identity for Korean culture. Okay, and in presentations, I've used this sort of matrix, which may or may not be, it was useful for presenting to grad students in China, but try and capture the extent to which the different strategies are commercially led or state-led or primarily based around information media or entertainment media, with, as I said, Russia and India as two very clear distinct categories. Okay, the case of China, the going out strategy, as I've discussed. Media has played a very central role in it, as Rawnsley. I should note that the strategy has been developed with the perception that China's image is a strategically important component of the country's continued modernisation and economic development, and an awareness that its relative lack of presence in global media content flows has a relationship to a negative perception of China internationally. But in contrast to a country such as Russia, or indeed to earlier Maoist history, China does not expand its international media presence primarily as part, or even necessarily, as part of an information war with the West. Rather, as Rawnsley has argued, there's a strong and abiding faith in the ability of international broadcasting to shape the global conversation around China, and that the Chinese must explain themselves and their behaviour to an international audience. As he terms it, the principle, to know us is to love us. The intangibles of public diplomacy can be converted via communication and international broadcasting into tangible foreign policy benefits. Okay, the opportunities are considerable. The large capacity for cultural capital investment in new cultural products, the large domestic market. And we note historically, I think it's important to be aware, when you think about Hollywood historically, we think about Hollywood as a global business, but at the core of that business has always been the large and quite diverse US domestic market. And most internationally successful products that come out of Hollywood in film and television have that base in the domestic market. There is very little that is successful internationally that is not successful domestically, although there's quite a bit that is successful domestically but not so internationally. The Chinese diaspora provides a significant opportunity. The ability to capture tacit knowledge and soft skills through collaborations and co-production agreements, a tech-savvy population with high aspirations, and the growing global strength of the Chinese internet firms. Challenges include the strong separation of news and entertainment in terms of state policy, the absence of arm's-length relationships to the state, the very different expectations of Chinese domestic audiences and international audiences, and that working in another respect that a historic distinction between content for Chinese audiences and content for international audiences is less and less possible in an age of global Twitter, as your point was made, Clayton. And Twitter is used by CCTV International, but Twitter is unavailable within China. Now, whether WeChat and so on provide an alternative to that, we'll see. But the point is that the idea of maintaining barriers between the domestic and the international is more and more difficult. An ambivalent relationship between China and the US. So I presented in China last year in the week in which the Trans-Pacific Partnership was announced, and it was certainly commented on several occasions that the Trans-Pacific Partnership had drawn together an Asia-Pacific economic network that excluded China. And it was also pointed out that President Obama, in advocating support for the TPP in Congress, had talked along the lines of saying this needs to be supported, otherwise China will develop an alternative arrangement. So we need to be aware of those tensions. And also, who is the target? The easiest audiences to reach, for example, expatriate Chinese, will not be generators of significant soft power. Now, I've talked a little bit about CCTV. I also want to say a bit about blockbusters. The Hollywood blockbuster has had and continues to have great cultural influence in China. At the same time, the moment of the Chinese blockbuster, the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon or Hero type film, having strong appeal within China has probably passed. Audience numbers are growing in China, but the most popular films are tending to be mid-budget films such as the Lost In series, Lost in Hong Kong, Lost in Thailand and so on. The Chinese interest in co-productions, an outlet for investment capital, which is a big issue across the board in China, the extent to which there is capital looking for new outlets, and the sensitivities that exist around investment in some other spheres, and that access to tacit knowledge and soft skills. The US interest in co-productions, access to Chinese finance, also access to that large domestic market. And particularly important here is the context of the distribution quota of 34 films a year in China, 34 foreign films a year in China, and the ability of co-productions to get in under the quota firewall. But the blockbuster is making its investors a lot of money. The box office figures for Furious 7, Fast and the Furious 7, are quite phenomenal, although now surpassed by Star Wars. But is any of this advancing awareness of China in the world? I would think not really. And indeed, to the extent to which films are more reflective in their content of that co-production arrangement, this is becoming something that Chinese audiences are increasingly viewing cynically. You know, the 5 minutes in Shanghai and so on.
The Chinese, would these films have more appeal to the Chinese audience if it had tokenism with Chinese actors? Whereas here, obviously, with African Americans, so you get the African American audience. You know, it's like it doesn't recognize people like to see themselves.
Yeah, to a degree, but I think it's also increasingly regarded cynically, particularly by young people in China. Like, oh, there's the token Chinese lead. So there is. I mean, to get the finance, and also particularly to get the approval to get within that distribution quota, some evidence of Chinese characteristics, if I was to put it that way, is favourable. But there is a sense that this is a game that Hollywood is playing. You know, this is not transferring any. You know, this is how to get into the market without providing any significant enhancement of Chinese capacity.
Let's hold on to questions for just a few more minutes until Professor Fu is finished.
Okay. I want to pick out an example that I think has been perhaps more successful, and that is, just let me see if I can get to.
你经常被人追问为什么单身吗？你的父母经常逼你找对象吗 ？Hello Australia， 我是孟非。 世界上最牛的相亲节目的主持人。我们和澳大利亚 SBS 2套合作，让优秀的澳大利亚单身的男女来到中国，来到非诚勿扰的舞台，赶紧报名，来到我们的舞台，我在这里等你们。I promise you, I will be nice.
This is If You Are the One, Fai Cheng Wu Rao. A dating show, first broadcast on Jiangsu television in 2010. Whoa, we may we may be being taken over by. Okay, it's great. It's great. It's very. This show is very popular in Australia. Very popular in Australia. It's actually based on what was an unsuccessful television format first developed in Australia, a program called Taken Out. You can have a look at it on YouTube if you want. It's pretty awful. But the concept of If You Are the One has worked very well, and has worked very well, yeah, as I said, with a very different audience. For SBS2, it's raised some interesting questions. Just to explain a couple of things there. SBS, the Special Broadcasting Service, is Australia's dedicated multicultural channel. At the same time, it's a multicultural channel that is partly advertiser-financed and expected to reach significant audiences and to have appeal outside of any single linguistic or ethnic group. SBS2 is a new channel that SBS has developed that aimed to attract, as public broadcasters around the world have had the issue, aimed to attract a younger audience and more male viewers. Now, the interesting thing about If You Are the One is that its real success has been with older female viewers. My mother, for instance, loves it. So you know, this is sort of, you know, this is actually a form of cultural soft power that is arguably working. That there's great interest in how dating would proceed in the Chinese context, and there is a sense in which a program like this is young China at play. But of course, it's a contentious program. What was then the SAFT warned in 2011 against conspicuous displays of wealth and the wrong values in the program. The famous young woman who said, I'd rather cry in a BMW than be happy on a bicycle. And, you know, and so you know, all contestants, and 24, if you don't know the format, 24 women offer an assessment of one man. Okay, so it's actually quite brutal. So when Ming Fei says, I will be nice, you don't be sure that he will be. And there are also two panellists who offer their own assessments of the young man who's come on to the show. But, okay, so there's a lot of talking around the values there. So I think you've got this interesting question, that what's genuinely popular may be the basis for expanding cultural soft power, but it does so in a context that what's genuinely popular may also prove to be politically or culturally sensitive within China. My concluding remarks. Two of the major paradigms in global communication and communication studies have been critical political economy and globalization theories, and I think what we've been discussing provides some insights into how to think of those today. Critical political economists have typically seen political, economic and cultural power as mutually reinforcing, with the dominant metropolitan centres controlling both the ownership of media industries and the global flows of media content, the Herb Schiller thesis I was presenting earlier. And these chains of domination and dependency between core and peripheral nations. Globalisation theorists, by contrast, have tended to look for discontinuity and disjuncture between these forms of power, and I'm thinking here of authors such as Arjuna Padgerai, Anthony Giddens, John Tomlinson and others, insisting that globalisation is not a one-way flow from the West to the rest, and the specificities of cultural power require close attention. The Chinese case tends to support globalisation theorists in this respect, as China presents a case where its rising economic power is in no doubt, but there is considerable anxiety among its leadership about its ongoing cultural trade deficit and the lack of commensurate cultural power. So at the same time, one of the features of the globalisation paradigm has tended to say that the power of the nation state is in relative decline. And I think that the evidence on the expansion of international broadcasting and other forms of media-based cultural diplomacy does not suggest that. And in the edited collection, Global Media and National Policies, The Return of the State, that I'm hoping my copy is sitting on my desk when I return to Australia next week, argues that nation states continue to play a central role in structuring the international media sphere. So how active are audiences in the shaping of cultural meaning? And if cultural meaning is with the power of the audiences rather than the producers and distributors, then what is the basis for all this investment in international broadcasting that's going on? I'd also note that there are implications that go beyond the scope of this presentation to think about how digital media and new public diplomacy debates, or the idea that you need to have influence through non-official channels and non-traditional broadcasting, how they intersect, because many of the initiatives I've pointed to in the Chinese context are very much top-down ones. It's actually something like If You Are the One comes much more serendipitously into a market like Australia than CCTV International comes onto your cable service. And so to conclude, I think these assertions, the scale of investments in new international broadcasting services, nation branding through culture, and collaborations and co-productions suggest that nation states do understand foreign audiences, whether validly or not, as figures that can be influenced in particular ways by media content. Such an assertion of national priorities suggests that we may now be heading into a post-globalisation era in terms of thinking about the relationship between global media content flows and the active agency of nation states and their national champions in the media. Thank you.